In this video, we are going to take a look at the most common mistakes that beginners make when they are learning to play the guitar. I've been teaching guitar for nearly 14 years now, and I've come across nearly every type of mistake that beginners can make. I've listed the most common ones in this video, and we're also going to look at how to correct them if you are making these mistakes. If you are a beginner and you are making any of these mistakes, don't worry, none of them are a complete disaster and they are easy fixes with practice. So without further ado, let's take a look at the first one on the list. Mistake number one is not resting the thumb on the neck. I talked about this in a previous video, which I will list and link in the description, about thumb placement on the guitar. If you'd like a full lesson on thumb placement on the guitar, then please do check out that video. But to summarize the main points in that video, the fretting hand thumb has to rest somewhere on the neck. So whether you use the thumb over the top technique like this, or the thumb behind the neck method like this, you must make sure that the fretting hand thumb is on the neck all the time. Too often I will see beginners try to tuck their thumb close to their palm when they're trying to reach up on the high frets, which will look something like this. The problem with that approach is that the thumb is actually providing you with the resistance in order to get a good grip on the guitar so that you can press down harder on the notes and the string. This will give you more control and greater expressiveness on the instrument. So even when you are reaching for those higher frets on the guitar, make sure that the thumb remains rested on the neck in some position. Even when you're reaching for the highest possible frets, try to hook your thumb like this and hook your hand and your fingers around in this position rather than trying to tuck the thumb under like this to play those same frets. While it's still possible to play the guitar like that, it will make things like string bends very difficult. Mistake number two is over adjusting your fretting hand position rather than the position of your fingers when you are accidentally muting strings. So I couldn't think of a shorter title to explain this concept, but I am going to explain it right now. Frequently, I will see beginners try to adjust their entire hand and wrist position rather than just the position of their fingers on the guitar when they can't fret chords or notes correctly. You would be surprised at how little you have to move your fingers and even your hand when you have not quite got a chord or a note right on the guitar. I'm going to switch to a close-up view to demonstrate this. So here's a C chord. I'm actually going to fret this incorrectly on purpose. When I strum through all the strings, you can hear that a couple of the notes aren't sounding quite right, even though I've placed my fingers on the correct frets on the guitar. I'll do that again. What can sometimes happen with beginners is once they have something incorrectly fretted, they'll try to over-adjust their hand and wrist position to compensate. So you'll get something that looks like this, where the wrist comes out and there's an awkward bend in the wrist here, and maybe the arm comes out as well, in order to do that. You don't actually have to go that far to fix most of the problems on guitar. Just the slightest movement in your left hand fingers can fix a lot of issues. So here's that chord again. I'm going to purposely fret it incorrectly. So what's happening here is my fingers aren't arched enough. It's not the position of my hand or my wrist, it's my fingers that aren't getting over enough to allow for those other open strings to ring out, and they're actually accidentally touching the other strings. So to fix that, I'm going to angle my fingers more like this. I'm not changing the angle of my wrist, which is nice and straight, or my hand position. I'm not changing the angle of my arm. I'm not sticking my elbow out even more. And suddenly that chord is perfect. So I went from this, completely wrong, hardly any sound, to this. Very simple fix. I arched my fingers more and I put my fingertips more on the strings like this, bending from this knuckle joint. Mistake number three is a slight contradiction to mistake number two, but hear me out. It's thinking that you can't touch the other strings on the guitar while you're playing single note lines. Now don't get me wrong, it's important when you're first starting to fret open chords and your first chords on the guitar that you get your fingers arched enough so that they don't touch the other strings. You can hear the open strings clearly and the other notes in the chord. But while you're playing other ideas on the guitar, like single note lead lines and other sequences where the majority of the strings are actually fretted, it's perfectly fine for your fretting hand to touch some of the other strings as they are doing it. So frequently what I will see with beginners is after they've learned their open chords and they've got into the habit of not touching the other strings, They think that suddenly this is a bad thing and that their fingers always have to be in this perfectly arched position where you don't touch any of the other strings that you're not playing. So for example, I will see people play a pentatonic scale in this manner. The problem with that is, although I was able to play it correctly, it was slightly inefficient and there's too much movement in your fretting hand. I'm going to show you this really close up. So when I play these single note lines and lead lines on the guitar, I actually get really close to the other strings. This also has the added benefit that I end up muting these strings. So you can see here that my finger is actually touching these strings that I'm not going to play. And I do that as I ascend this scale. So I shall do that pattern again, and this time you can see how close my finger is to the strings. My ring finger does it as well. My ring finger actually touches that D string as I'm ascending this scale. So I went from this to this. You can see that it looks a lot more efficient and I'm making less effort in that second example, which will really help you in your progress, particularly when you start looking at playing faster, more complicated ideas. Mistake number 4 is not practicing the older material in your repertoire. When you first start learning the guitar, it's absolutely crucial that you practice as much of what you have learned as possible. So too often I will see that I will start teaching beginners. I will show them what to do for this week's lesson, whether that be we work on a specific song or specific scales or some kind of technique. They will then come back to me a week or 2 weeks later for the next lesson. They'll have everything perfectly done. I will show them something new and they will never practice that previous material again because they think they've done it. As a beginner, you need to make sure that you are going through everything that you have worked on for at least the first year or two, almost every time you sit down and practice. Now, I know that can be challenging, particularly if you are an adult learner with limited time on your hands, but you must at least make one session per week where you revisit older material. It's really easy to forget some of the things that you spent so hard working on and some of those skills that you spent ages developing. So you need to keep it as fresh in your mind as you possibly can. So whether you're having guitar lessons or whether you're self-taught, make sure you go over that older material as often as you can after you have learned what you're supposed to be working on that week. Mistake number 5, not practicing enough. Again, this ties into point number 4, but I do see this quite often with people when they first start learning guitar and that they think that one practice session per week is enough to make significant progress. You need to be practicing as often as you can. So even if that is just for 10-15 minutes per day, that's better than one cram session per week where you practice for 3 hours. So try doing something every day. I often get students asking me what's better. Is it better to practice for 10 minutes per day or is it better to practice for one 3-hour session per week? And I often reply, in an ideal world, you would practice 3 hours per day. I know that's not possible for everyone, and even 1 hour per day can seem like a lot when you've got a busy life. But do try and pick the guitar up every day for at least 10 to 15 minutes and work on what you're supposed to be doing, rather than doing just one bulk cram session per week, and then you will start to see progress even if it is minimal at first. Mistake number 6 is not practicing in time. One of the main causes for beginners not progressing as much as they should on the guitar is that they do not practice their material in time, so either to a metronome, a drum beat, or practicing the song along to the original recording. A lot of the times I will show someone a new song on the guitar and I will tell them to go away and practice it, only to find that when they come back for the next session that they've spent the whole time just practicing the parts alone and in isolation. The problem with this method is that once you find yourself in a situation where you have to play in time, so whether you're playing with other people, in a band, or even just by yourself, you can't do it. The chord changes seem much harder and perhaps you can't even make them in the first place. So do make sure that although it's a bit of a blow to the ego at first, make sure that you set a metronome up, a drum beat, or put the original recording on for the song that you're trying to learn and practice the material in time and force yourself to make those changes, whether you're learning a lead line, a chord progression, or whatever. People who do this will make the most progress on the instrument versus people who sit there and try and practice the material unaccompanied or without any kind of rhythm to it. Mistake number 7 is putting too much pressure on the strings or squeezing too hard down on the strings and on the frets. This is another technique mistake that I see frequently from beginners. I think it comes from when they first pick up the guitar and they're quite surprised by how hard you have to press down on the instrument in order to fret a note and in order to get it sounding correctly. So the tendency and the temptation is to over squeeze and overexert the force needed to press down on those strings. The problem with this is that you will frequently push the string out of tune and it won't sound very good. I see this a lot with beginners when they start playing ideas on the low E string in particular. I think the psychology is that because it's a thicker string, you have to press down really hard in order to get the notes ringing clearly. Frequently, I will see this with a G chord, for example, when beginners go to press down on that low E string and they accidentally bend that string out of tune, and that you'll get something that sounds like this. The problem is that that string now sounds like you haven't tuned the guitar correctly because you're squeezing down so hard. The other problem you'll have is that that amount of pressure could lead to some kind of injury at some point because you're exerting more force than you need to from your fingers and your wrist. So to combat that, here's a tip. Place your finger anywhere on the neck and try to put down the least amount of pressure as you possibly can. I'm going to go for the 5th fret on the G string as an example. I'm going to start by just resting my finger gently on this string. I'm going to pick that string, and at first I'm going to get no sound because I'm not pressing down hard enough, like this. I'm going to gradually squeeze and apply more pressure to this string. It's buzzing there, it doesn't sound too good, so I need to press down just a little bit harder. And there you have it, it's a nice clear note. I don't need to press down any harder than that. Once you've figured that out, you might be surprised at how little you actually do have to press down on the string in comparison to what you were doing before. Mistake number 8 is thinking that you can place your finger anywhere on the fret in order to sound the note. I get this a lot with beginners when they first start playing. The problem is that, for example, when I tell people to press down on fret 2 of the B string, they will do something like this. The problem is that, and I forgive people for thinking this, but when you look at the guitar and you're told to press down on a fret, you'll be forgiven for thinking that you can press down anywhere on this fret and it will sound okay. The problem is that particularly on these lower frets on the instrument, is that the further you get towards the previous fret, so for example, if I'm on fret 2 and I start to drift towards fret 1, it doesn't sound very good, like in the example that I just did. The sweet spot is somewhere between the middle of the fret and closer to the next fret that you want to play. So for example, if I'm on fret 2, the sweet spot is in the middle here, or ideally close to fret 3. Suddenly I get a nice clear note. I get the same clear note there. If I'm too close to fret 1, the same amount of pressure yields no results. So again, I'm going to apply the same amount of pressure on this fret, and you can actually hear where it starts to sound good. By the way, it's absolutely fine, and I encourage people to get as close as they can to the fret wire without pressing on it. This means that if you need to do things like go up to fret number 4, you've actually got slightly less distance to travel than if you're back here, making it more efficient if you can place your finger close to here. Alright, so that just about wraps up this video for today. I hope you found that useful. Once again, if you are making any of these mistakes on the guitar, I hope that you can correct those mistakes using the tips that I provided in this video. Again, none of them are absolutely disastrous, none of them are deal breakers. If you are doing any of them, simply fix them. You've got plenty of time, and with practice, you'll be well on your way to perfecting your technique and your mindset on the instrument. Thanks very much for checking out this video. If you found it helpful, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell to get notified of any of my future guitar lessons or backing tracks. Thanks again. I'm Paul Burke. Check out my website, colchesterguitarteacher.com. Take care and enjoy guitar playing. Thank you.